Hello everyone, today I have another knife review on the Spyderco Shaman. This is a new release from Spyderco and it's been getting a lot of publicity lately, and I recently got it and I carried it for about a week and I feel like I am now qualified to give a review on it. I have used it a ton. I don't know if you can still kind of see the residue on the blade, but I have definitely put this through its paces to get an idea of what it's like, and I have carried it a significant amount now, especially considering the time that I've owned it. I haven't owned this knife for very long, but I have been using it 100% while I've been owning it. So first let's talk about size. Let's do a size comparison here. Here is the Spyderco Paramilitary 2, which we will be doing more comparisons between these two throughout the review. And here is the Stryder SNG. We will be doing more comparisons with this knife as well. If you prefer smaller knives, maybe you like the Delica or the small Sebenza or the mini grip, then this is not the knife for you. It is definitely a larger knife. Maybe the Native would be a better option for you if you like smaller knives, and that brings me kind of to my next point, which is this is pretty much a larger Native. If you're familiar with Spyderco series, you'll know the Native 5 has been there for a few years now, and you might start putting pieces together now if you didn't already know. This is pretty much a larger Native. If you look at the blade shape and the handle, for the most part, it is just a larger Native. And I think that's where the name Shaman comes from, because a Shaman is kind of like a leader of a tribe, and the Native 5 would be kind of the members of those tribes. So this is kind of the leader. And I think that's just kind of interesting, and I think it's cool how they named it that. But this is pretty much an upscale Native 5 with some differences. But overall, it's still going to fill that same role, which is kind of a tactical blade. Let me adjust my background, I apologize. Which is kind of a tactical, hard use blade. And that's why I'm going to be comparing it significantly with the Stryder, because I see this as the Spyderco Stryder, honestly. There are a lot of similarities, and I feel like it fulfills the same role. So I will be going on and discussing that, but first let's just jump right into the main part of this review, and let's talk about the blade here. The blade is Spyderco's leaf shape, kind of drop point blade shape. I guess you could say spear point too, but let's just say leaf shape. It's very common among Spydercos. It is very functional. It gives you a nice amount of belly. I'm sure that if you're watching this review, you've had experience with it. The steel on it, as you can see there, is CPM S30V, much like what is on the Spyderco Paramilitary 2. And let's just talk about that real quick. S30V is not a bad steel. It is kind of the plain Jane steel, meaning you see that on a lot of production knives around the mid-price range, like the Benchmade 940, the Spyderco Paramilitary 2, the Manix 2. Spyderco and Benchmade typically will use it a lot, and it's a good steel. It's a good steel. In my cutting, I've cut a lot with this and with the mini grip recently, and actually with the small Sebenza, and I can tell it is definitely the lesser, especially this is a 2017 Sebenza, so it's got the new heat treat that's harder. These two are very close, almost unnoticeable. This one is better by a decent margin, but nothing that's like disappointing. So S30V is a good steel. As Spyderco does it, it's pretty easy to sharpen and it holds an edge nicely. You do need to worry about it chipping out a little bit. I've heard that is less of a problem now, and I haven't had a problem with it. But here's the issue. We're going to jump into price real quick and kind of jump around. This knife was originally $140-ish. Now it is around $180. It had a price jump. And a lot of people are upset about that. And I think that it is still worth $180, but I would like to see some changes because it is $180 now. Specifically, I would like to see an upgrade in blade steel, maybe to S35VN. if you remember, the original Native 5, or the Native 5, is an S35 VN, and so I think that it's a little interesting that they added $100 to the price tag now, since it's $180. They added G10 and they changed the handle, and of course they made everything bigger, and they put a compression lock in it, but they kind of lowered the blade steel, and I would have liked the blade steel to stay the same, especially if you're paying $100 more and then you're dropping down to S30. That's not the best thing in the world, but S30V is definitely good enough for a lot of your uses, and it's good enough for this task, the task of being a hard use kind of knife. The S&G does it well. Of course, Stryder's heat treat is better than Spyderco's, but Spyderco's heat treat is not bad, and it still is able to fill the role nicely. So now let's talk about the finish. This is a uniquely stonewash finish from Golden, Colorado. It's not really a blasted finish, but I think it's really good for this knife because it's able to hide. If you do use this knife hard and you scratch it up, it's able to hide that well. And it's not like, you know, the Paramilitary 2 where you'll be able to see all the scratches in that satin blade. So I think it's nice. Personally, I prefer satin blades, but for this blade, I think that they did a good job, or they chose well going for the stonewash. The grind. All right, now let's pull the Stryder out again, because their grind is almost identical, in my opinion. If you look at it, they're both almost full flat ground, but there is a flat that runs along the top of the blade, and it is almost identical looking at both the Shaman and the S&G. What that does is it gives you still a good slicing performance, but it gives the blade a little bit more rigidity and a little bit more strength up in this portion of the blade, where you compare it to kind of the Paramilitary 2 that's a full flat ground knife, and it's the blade is a lot thinner, and it just has less strength there, and this gives it strength for prying as well. So that's one comparison. They both slice really well. The Paramilitary 2 is definitely the better slicer of the three. Then it would be the Shaman, and then not by much, but then the Stryder comes in third. So the Shaman slices much more like the S&G than like the Paramilitary 2, but it is still a really good slicer. It still slices about as good as this mini grip, which has a lot thinner blade stock because the mini grip has big flats and is hollow ground. So this knife still slices well. It does not slice as well as the Manix 2 or the Paramilitary 2 or the Paramilitary 3, I guess, for that matter. But it is not disappointing, and it's still a good slicer. But it has that added strength from the flats. One thing I also want to talk about this blade as far as the grind goes, it's got a very broad blade. I mean, even compared to the S&G, just compare it to the Paramilitary 2. Even the Slish buoy, which I consider to kind of have a broad blade, you compare, and the Shaman is still broader. So I think what they were kind of going for there is they wanted to have the strength part of the blade, but they wanted it to be a good slicer, and so to do that they had to have a little bit of a broader blade. And I think that works. It has a finger choil with these kind of long flats, or the Ricasso that's just really large, similar to the S&G. The edge geometry, this one kind of has a skinny bevel, as you can see, and it is sharpened to 18 degrees per side. Right now, the Stryder is sharpened to 15 degrees per side. You can see that it's a fair bit larger. So I'm sure I could get the Shaman to the same length, but I wanted it to be 18 degrees per side because I would rather beat this blade up than the S&G, even though the S&G could probably, the S&G will take it just as well as the Shaman. But the real reason I got this is going to be my main beater knife. I do contracting work sometimes, and this is going to be the knife that falls in my pocket more often than not. So it slices well. It's got 18 degrees per side, and I believe that's a standard angle from Spyderco also, so they're kind of it's different than the Paramilitary 2 as far as that goes, which I believe this is kind of like a 14-degree angle on the Paramilitary 2. So let me get that out of the way. Well, now let's move on to the handle. The handle material is G10. It has this stainless steel backspacer that kind of balances it out. The main thing is that it's G10 over the FRN or whatever the Native 5 was made in. So that is a big step up. You now get G10 handles, which you is found on the Hinders and the SNGs instead of plastic. So that's like I said, that's definitely a step up. Not only that, but they're contoured. They're contoured very nicely. You can see the ridges on there. It's not a flat piece of G10 like what's on the Paramilitary 2, but it is contoured, which makes it very comfortable in the hand. Your hand feels very at home here. Sorry, moving the background again. I apologize. So that's definitely another plus on this knife, is the ergonomics just fit right in. Other reviewers have talked about how the inside corner of these liners are sharp, and it kind of is, but you really don't feel it unless you're moving your hand around it. In just normal use, it's not a factor. As far as carryability, this knife is fairly heavy in the pocket. You can look up the exact weight, but it's somewhere around 4 or 5 ounces. I believe it's right in between those. And I mean, it's worth it. It's heavier than the SNG, definitely. But you get something with that weight. The weight is because the blade is so broad, which we talked about. That adds cutting ability that the SNG with kind of a thinner blade doesn't have. And the stainless steel backspacer is kind of there to balance the blade out. The pivot, let's talk about hardware. It has a bushing pivot system. So that is what is on the Paramilitary 2. However, it is more like the bushing pivot system on the Paramilitary 3 because it's got the inset stop pin, which is a lot better, because the only problems with the Paramilitary 2 was it was inconsistent because of the tightness of the stop pins versus the actual pivot, and it could cause issues, but you don't have to worry about those issues with the Shaman. The deployment hole is large and oversized, just like the Mannix 2 and the Paramilitary 2. So that's good, which means this works especially well with gloved hands, which you would hope, considering the role that this knife fills. The pocket clip is standard Spyderco. I believe this is similar to what's on the Delica, the Native 5, and the Tenacious. I could be wrong on a few of those, but it's not the same clip that is on the Paramilitary 2 or the Mannix 2. You can see they are slightly different. It's not particularly a high rider, but a decent amount is out of your pocket. That doesn't bother me at all, because I prefer to have a little bit to grab onto in some occasions. So I wouldn't consider that a bad. I'm just letting y'all know. Now let's talk about the internals. The bushings, or the inside of this knife, contains washers. It is very smooth, as you can see, because of the heavy blade and the smoothness. It is definitely a free dropper. Very fun to use. However, it does have a much stronger detent than the Paramilitary 2. Now, let me show you Paramilitary 2. I use wrist, and I close it like that, and the blade kind of bounces out because the detent isn't strong enough to hold it. Now, I'm going to do the same thing with the Shaman, and in order for the blade to not close by the detent, I have to really fling my wrist into it. If I do it just a medium amount, then it still closes, the detent catches it. I'm just trying to show you how this knife, the detent is stronger. You can also tell by the difference in sound whenever the blade closes. the detent is much more apparent here, and to the point where it took a while for me to, the first time I struggled flipping it open the first time with the Spidey finger, because the detent is so strong that you have to get used to that. And sometimes I'll occasionally slip like that because the detent is in there. And I think that part of that is because the lock bar pressure is also much more substantial than what's on the Paramilitary 2. Now, I think the best way for me to describe the difference is it is kind of like the difference between the lock bar on a Sebenza and on a XM18. You know that the XM18 has a fairly light lock bar and the Sebenza has a stronger lock bar. Or maybe even the Sebenza and the Norseman, because the Norseman kind of has a light lock bar too. Or if you're into Spydercos a lot more, it's like the Sage 1 versus the Gale Bradley. This would be the Gale Bradley liner lock, and this would be the Sage 1 liner lock. So I think that gives a little bit more strength to the knife. I could be completely off, but I think that's what it's also supposed to do. It's supposed to inspire confidence, and I think that this knife, the lock bar system, definitely does that, and the stronger detent and the stronger leaf. The centering is perfect, no blade play of course in this compression lock. It is all very well done. Fin finish is standard Golden, Colorado, which is where this is made. Now let's go through and just talk about the major pros and the major cons of this knife. The major pro is Spyderco is now offering a knife that's very comparable to the SNG in many ways as far as how it's made. It is taking the native, which is kind of a hard use knife, and making it smaller. Putting a compression lock, which is many people's favorite Spyderco lock, putting that in there. It is just a strong working blade that works well with gloved hands and still slices well, but has extra toughness if you need it. Doesn't slice like a Manix 2, but it will definitely hold up and be able to take more of a beating than a Manix 2, and will be able to work a little bit harder. So is this knife recommended? Yes, it is. I think if you are looking for a Spyderco Stryder or a hard use knife, if you want a hard use knife, this is a good one, and the steel will not let you down. This is just a good EDC as well. It's balanced in many ways, in that it still slices well, it has strength, it's ergonomic, all that. It's just a well-balanced knife. And that is something that the Paramilitary 2 is more of a slicer and more of a tactical blade, but it is not quite a hard use blade and doesn't have nearly as much as the strength as the Shaman does. So if that is what you're looking for, then yes, buy the Shaman. If you want more of just an EDC slicer, then I would say look towards the Paramilitary 2, the Paramilitary 3, the Manix. There are better options from Spyderco as far as just regular EDC slicing blades go. So that is about it for the Shaman review. I think I'm gonna, whoops, excuse me. For me, I believe this is a keeper. I don't plan on, sorry, apologize for this. I don't plan on getting rid of it. It has a spot in the collection. I almost sold it because it is so similar to the Stryder, but I feel like it's different enough because it's a Spyderco compression lock, a little bit more fun to play with, definitely much cheaper, that it has a spot in the collection. So yeah, stay tuned on the channel. I'm going to be doing an EDC and collection update soon. I have made a few changes since my last one, and just overall recently for me, I have recently gotten another Paramilitary 2, I've gotten the Shaman, I've gotten the mini grip, and I've switched my large Sebenza for a small Insingo, so I'm planning on talking about all of that. But as far as this review, it is done, so I will catch y'all in the next video.